70,000 people died. And the sky was perfectly clear. No storm, no flood, no fire came sweeping through. Just sunshine and heat and silence in apartments across an entire continent. We think of heat as something to complain about, a reason to stay inside and drink lemonade, but in the summer of 2003 heat became a weapon, and Europe had no idea how to fight it. We will follow the science that explains why our bodies fail in extreme heat. We will stand inside the morgues that ran out of room. We will climb the mountains that cracked open from the warmth, and we will find out what one catastrophic summer taught the world about survival. This is the story of the deadliest heatwave in modern history. It is also a warning, because the conditions that made it possible are already building again. August in Paris is quiet. Half the city packs up and leaves, the restaurants close, the streets empty, families load their cars and drive south to the coast, and behind them they leave the elderly, the poor, and the sick. That August was no different. Except the heat came. It arrived in early June 2003, a slow creep that most people wrote off as a good summer. France had seen warm summers before. By July, the temperatures were climbing past 90 degrees. Still, no one panicked. Europeans were not used to air conditioning. They had thick stone buildings. They had shade. They believed they could handle heat. They were wrong. When August arrived, the temperature in parts of France stayed above 95 degrees Fahrenheit for 2 full weeks, day after day. The nights never cooled. That was the part that made it lethal. A hot day your body can survive? A hot night is where the killing happens, because your body counts on darkness to recover. The old stone apartments that had kept Parisians cool for centuries became traps. The thick walls absorbed heat all day and held it through the night like a slow cooker. In the tiny apartments of the city's oldest neighbourhoods, elderly men and women lay in the dark, unable to sleep, too hot to move. Many were already struggling. They had high blood pressure. They lived alone. Some could barely walk from room to room, and the heat just kept pressing down. The government was on vacation. The health minister was on vacation. Hospitals were running at reduced staff. France takes August seriously, and 2003 was no exception. No emergency heat plan existed. No alert system was watching. When the death reports started arriving at city hospitals, the numbers were so shocking that officials at first assumed a recording error. There was no error. The scale of what happened in those 2 weeks still shocks scientists who study it today. And it started with something that sounds completely ordinary: a sunny summer. A high-pressure system sitting over Western Europe. That is where the science of this disaster begins. Because something in the sky locked the heat in place, and it refused to let go. Weather moves. That is the normal state of things. Cold air from the north pushes warm air south. Wind sweeps moisture off the Atlantic and carries it across Europe. Rain falls, the ground cools, and the cycle starts again. This is what summer in France is supposed to look like. In the summer of 2003, the cycle stopped. A massive high-pressure system settled over Western Europe in late July and held its position for weeks. Meteorologists call this kind of event a blocking pattern. Picture a traffic jam on a highway, but in the atmosphere. Normal weather systems, the kind that bring cooling winds and rain, kept trying to push through from the west. The high-pressure mass sat like a wall and turned them away. The Atlantic air that should have swept over France and Spain and Germany was rerouted, shunted north towards Scandinavia, leaving the whole centre of the continent to bake under a lid of still stagnant air. With no clouds and no wind, the sun hammered the ground without interruption. The ground cooked. The soil, already dry from a spring with below-average rainfall, had nothing to give back to the atmosphere. In a normal summer, soil moisture evaporates and rises and eventually becomes rain. Dry soil skips that step. The heat that would have gone into evaporation instead went straight into the air above, compounding the temperatures already being pushed down from the trapped system above. Think of it like a phone that runs hot when you do too many things at once. The atmosphere was overloaded. Heat from the sun, heat from the ground, and no wind to carry any of it away. Temperatures in parts of France and Spain hit readings that had never been recorded before in those countries. Portugal saw the mercury climb to 117 degrees in one location. a wall of heat reached all the way to Britain, where England recorded its highest temperature since records began in the 19th century. Scientists would later call the summer of 2003 the hottest in Europe since at least 1540. 500 years, and unlike a single record-breaking day, this heat was relentless. It stayed, it accumulated, and as the days stacked up, something even more dangerous was happening inside human bodies across the continent. Your body is a cooling machine. It runs at 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, and it will do almost anything to stay there. When you overheat, you sweat. The moisture on your skin pulls heat away as it evaporates, the same way a wet cloth cools you when you wave it through the air. Your heart beats faster, pumping blood to the surface of your skin so the heat can escape. Your breathing quickens. Every system in your body coordinates to pull the temperature back to safe. But this only works within limits. If the air around you is already almost as hot as your body, sweating loses its power. If you're also dehydrated, you run out of fluid to sweat. If you're elderly, your ability to sense heat and trigger sweating slows down with age. And if the heat goes on for days without the night ever cooling down, your body has no window to recover. When your core temperature climbs past 104 degrees Fahrenheit, the trouble accelerates fast. You become confused. Your judgment goes. Many people in this state feel cold because their brain is misfiring. They do not know they're dying. At 105 degrees, the proteins inside your brain cells begin to break apart. The same thing that happens to an egg white in a hot pan is happening in your neurons. Your heart muscle weakens, your kidneys start to fail, your blood loses its ability to clot, which can trigger bleeding inside your organs. This is what doctors call heat stroke. And in August 2003, it was happening behind closed doors across an entire continent, to people who were alone, confused, and had no way to call for help. The ones most at risk were those living in small apartments on the upper floors of old Parisian buildings. Heat rises. Top-floor rooms with low ceilings and no cross-ventilation could reach temperatures far above what the street recorded. These were often the cheapest apartments in the city, home to the oldest residents. And in August, the neighbours who might have checked on them were 300 miles away at the beach. By the time the first reports reached hospitals, doctors were already overwhelmed. And what nobody in the government had anticipated was just how fast a heatwave could turn into a crisis of a completely different kind. France is a country famous for the way it cares for its old. The healthcare system is excellent. Elder care is a point of national pride. And yet in August 2003, something broke. It broke so completely that France ran out of places to put its dead. By the second week of August, Paris had more bodies than its morgues could hold. The mortuaries filled up. The city ran out of hearses. Officials scrambled to find a solution, and the one they landed on still shocks people who read about it today. Refrigerated food trucks, the kind that carry vegetables to market, were converted into temporary morgues and parked around the city. An old wholesale food market south of Paris was commandeered to store bodies by the hundreds. And still, the bodies came. When the vacationing families began returning home in late August, some of them walked into their apartment buildings to a smell that told them something was deeply wrong before they reached the door. Bodies had lain undiscovered in sealed apartments for days, in some cases weeks. Nearly 100 people in Paris died and were never claimed at all. Their families never came. These were the ones who had lived so alone, so cut off from anyone who cared, that even in death they had no one. The city buried them at public expense in the poorest section of a cemetery in the southern suburbs, with almost no one present. The health minister, upon returning from his own vacation, made a statement that would define the political fallout of the disaster. He blamed not the government, but the French people. He said the deaths happened because neighbours were too busy vacationing to check on the vulnerable. That statement was made while he was photographed in a polo shirt, and France did not forgive him for it quickly. What the numbers showed was something harder to dismiss. About half of the dead in France had died at home, not in hospitals or nursing homes. They had died in their apartments, alone, without anyone knowing. Some had relatives who were reachable. The calls just never happened. The checks never came. And behind that failure was a deeper story about how modern cities had allowed loneliness to become invisible, and how catastrophe makes the invisible suddenly, terribly visible. The people who died in France were mostly women. They were mostly over 75. They mostly lived alone, and almost every one of them lived in conditions that turned their home into a slow oven the moment the outside temperature stopped dropping at night. Scientists who studied the deaths found patterns that told a precise story. Living on the top floor under the roof increased the risk. Having no insulation in the walls increased the risk. Being unable to move easily, to get water, to open windows and create a draft, all of these increased the risk. Chronic illness, high blood pressure, heart disease, all increased the risk. But the single most powerful factor was something simpler than any medical condition: loneliness. People who had regular human contact, a friend who called, a neighbour who checked in, a family member who lived nearby, were far more likely to survive. The heat killed them too. But someone could call an ambulance, someone could bring water, someone could notice. For the people who died alone, there was no one to notice. Their deaths happened in private, invisible to a city that had, for a few weeks, stopped paying attention. This pattern had been studied before. In 1995, Chicago suffered a devastating heat wave that killed hundreds of people in 5 days. A sociologist named Eric Klinenberg spent years after that disaster mapping the deaths against the city's neighborhoods. He found that the blocks with the highest death rates were also the blocks with the fewest people outside, the fewest open businesses, the most abandoned buildings, places where no one watched out for anyone. Heat turns loneliness into a death sentence. That finding from Chicago arrived in Europe as a warning. Nobody acted on it in time. The question that would haunt researchers for years afterward was this: how many of those who died were killed by heat, and how many were killed by something that had been quietly building long before the weather turned? The heat did not only kill people, it reshaped the physical world in ways that seemed impossible for something as familiar as a hot summer. The river Danube, one of the longest rivers in Europe, dropped to its lowest level in 100 years. In Serbia, the water fell so low that it exposed the bottoms of old bends and stretches that had been underwater for decades, and what it revealed was extraordinary. World War II weapons had been sitting on the bottom of the Danube for 60 years, bombs and armoured vehicles that sank during the fighting in 1944 and 1945. They surfaced in 2003, visible, dangerous, and eerily intact. Across Portugal, more than 500,000 acres of forest burned. That is an area larger than the state of Rhode Island, stripped to ash in a single summer. The fires were so severe that millions of tons of topsoil eroded in the following year, washing into the rivers and turning the water brown. Up in the Alps, something quieter and stranger was happening. Climbers heading for the summit of the Matterhorn, one of the most famous mountain peaks in the world, were turned back when a section of cliff collapsed. The permafrost that holds mountain rock in place had softened in the heat. Stone that had been frozen solid for centuries was coming loose. Glaciers across Switzerland shrank at a rate that left scientists checking their measurements twice. One glacier in the Alps lost 10% of its mass in a single summer. In France, the heat forced something that seemed almost absurd at the time. The country's nuclear power plants use river water to cool their reactors. When that river water becomes too hot, the reactors cannot use it, and under French law, they cannot dump heated water back into already hot rivers without damaging the fish. 17 reactors across the country had to cut their power or shut down entirely during the worst weeks of the wave. The country that generates most of its electricity from nuclear plants suddenly could not power all of its air conditioners at the moment it needed them most. What scientists were watching was a cascade. One crisis feeding another. Heat leading to drought, drought feeding fires, fires eroding soil, heat melting mountains, heat shutting down the power. And at the centre of all of it, the question that was already forming in the minds of climate researchers who would spend the next decade answering it. Did human beings cause this? In 2004, a team of scientists at Oxford University published a paper that changed the conversation about extreme weather forever. They had spent months running computer simulations of the 2003 summer, asking a specific question. How likely was a heatwave this severe in a world without human greenhouse gas emissions? And how likely was it in the world we actually live in, where those emissions have been building for over a century? The answer stunned the scientific community. Human activity had at least doubled the probability of the 2003 event occurring. Doubled it. That was the conservative estimate. The researchers were careful to say they could not point to emissions and declare them the sole cause of the wave. The the same way you cannot blame a single cigarette for a lung cancer diagnosis, but they could measure the odds, and the odds had been stacked by human hands. The paper marked the beginning of what scientists now call climate attribution. Before it, researchers tended to say that any individual weather event was too complicated to link directly to global warming. After it, a new field emerged dedicated to exactly that question. A team of scientists, a set of climate models, and a heat wave or a flood or a drought, and within weeks they could quantify how much human activity had tilted the likelihood of the event. What those scientists found in 2003 would grow starker with each passing year. A later study, looking specifically at deaths in Paris, calculated that climate change had increased the probability of heat-related death in the city by 70% during that summer. Out of every 10 people who died of heat in Paris, 7 of those deaths traced back, at least in part, to the warming humans had already added to the atmosphere. The work forced a reckoning. Europe had not experienced a summer like 2003 since 1540. 5 centuries. But the researchers kept asking a harder question. When would a summer like that happen next? The answer to that question arrived faster than most people expected. When the Oxford team published their initial work in 2004, they estimated that a summer as extreme as 2003 would happen roughly once every 500 years in a world without human emissions. In the world they were actually measuring. With all the warming already accumulated, they put the odds at roughly once every 30 years. Once every 30 years was still rare. But the accumulation of emissions did not stop in 2004. It continued. And as scientists ran newer and more detailed models in the years that followed, the numbers kept shifting in the same direction. By 2014, a team at the British Weather Service concluded that what had been a once-in-a-thousand-year event before widespread industrialization was by then happening roughly once in a century, 10 times more likely than it had been before humans started burning fossil fuels at scale. By 2040, they projected a summer like 2003 could arrive every other year. Sit with that for a moment. The deadliest peacetime disaster in modern French history. A summer that killed more people than any natural disaster France had seen since World War II. And it was on track to become a regular event within the lifetime of most people alive today. The implications were enormous. Europe had built its cities, its architecture, its entire way of a life around a climate that was in the process of being replaced. Stone buildings with no air conditioning, urban centres designed for shade and stone, not for heat emergencies. Healthcare systems staffed for typical summer demand, not for catastrophic wave events. All of that infrastructure now faced a future it had never been designed for. But the story of 2003 does not end in despair, because France, shaken and humiliated by what had happened, decided to do something it had never done before. France had always been proud of its social systems, universal healthcare, strong elder care, the principle of solidarity baked into the national motto, and yet the summer of 2003 had exposed a crack that ran through all of it. The state had no system for tracking whether elderly people living alone were in danger, no phone tree, no heat alert, no registry of vulnerable residents who might need a check-in call. If you were old and isolated and living in a top-floor apartment in August, you were on your own, and the government would find out you had died approximately 2 weeks later when your neighbours returned from the coast. France decided in the immediate aftermath that this would never happen again. Within a year of the disaster, the government had built a 4-level heat alert system. It was tied directly to the National Weather Service. When temperatures crossed specific thresholds, the alert moved from green to yellow to orange to red, and each level triggered specific actions. At the highest level, local governments were required to open cooling centres, contact registered at-risk residents, and establish a national crisis coordination centre. The registry was perhaps the most important piece. For the first time, France built a national list of elderly people living alone, people with disabilities, and others considered high risk during extreme heat. When an alert fired, those people received phone calls. Social workers checked on them. It was exactly what had been absent in 2003. Personal contact. Someone asking, "Are you all right?" The system was tested almost immediately. A heatwave struck France in 2006. The temperatures were serious, not as severe as 2003 but significant. With the new system running, researchers estimated that the death toll was more than half what it would have been without the changes in place. More than half. In 3 years, France had rebuilt its response to heat emergencies from nothing into one of the most effective systems in the world. What France built after 2003 was a lesson in what cities can actually do when they commit to change. But the country did not stop at phone calls and alert systems. It looked at the physical city itself, the concrete and stone and asphalt, and recognized that Paris was making its own heat problem worse. Cities trap heat. Everyone who lives in one knows this. On a hot summer day, a park feels noticeably cooler than the surrounding streets. The grass absorbs some of the sun, the trees shade the ground, the soil breathes, but pavement and concrete and brick absorb the heat and hold it, releasing it slowly through the night. City centres end up several degrees warmer than the countryside around them. Scientists call this the urban heat island effect, and it is especially severe in dense historic cities like Paris, where green space is limited and stone buildings line narrow streets that trap warm air. Research on the 2003 disaster showed clearly that mortality was higher in the densest, most built-up parts of Paris. People living in neighbourhoods with more trees and parks survived at higher rates. The stone and concrete of the city's densest blocks amplified the heat at the street level, and at night, instead of cooling down, those streets just kept radiating the heat they had stored all day. Paris took this seriously. Over the following decade and a half, the city planted thousands of trees and created a network of green spaces connected by walkways. By 2019, the next significant heatwave to hit France, officials could point to 100 cooling islands spread across the city, parks and pools and shaded walkways within a short walk of almost any resident. Where 2003 had caught Paris with nothing, 2019 found the city with a plan. The death toll in Paris during that wave was around 300 people. In 2003, over 1,000 Parisians had died. The progress was real, and the trees had helped make it. As France was rethinking its cities and alert systems, researchers were asking a different kind of question. Not just who died in 2003, but why certain people survived when they probably should not have. The patterns were puzzling at first. In some of the worst affected neighbourhoods in Paris, researchers found small pockets where survival rates were unexpectedly high. The temperatures in these places were just as brutal, the buildings were just as old, the residents were just as elderly. But fewer people died. What these pockets shared was the presence of businesses that stayed open during August. A bakery, a corner shop, a pharmacy. Somewhere that elderly residents walked to every day, where someone knew their name and their face, where if they stopped appearing, someone would notice. This finding clicked into place with everything that had been established about social isolation and heat death. The mechanism was connection, a simple transaction, buying a baguette, passing the pharmacist on the way to the counter, exchange pleasantries with the woman who ran the tobacco. These small routine contacts were not just pleasant, they were protective. They formed a web of informal surveillance that a formal government system could not fully replicate. The implication for city planners and public health officials was significant. Designing heat resilience is not just about cooling centres and phone trees, important as those are. It is also about designing neighbourhoods where people run into each other, where daily life creates contact, where isolation never gets the chance to become invisible. 2003 was a human catastrophe. It was also, in its painful way, a masterclass in what communities need to survive. 62 miles south of Paris, on the banks of the Loire River, sits a set of structures you would recognise immediately as a power plant. Cooling towers, transmission lines, the low hum of industry. This is the Belleville nuclear power station, and in the summer of 2003 it faced a problem that nobody had thought to put in the emergency manual. The Loire was too hot. France generates most of its electricity from nuclear power, and nuclear plants work by using enormous amounts of water. Water from a nearby river flows in, absorbs the heat from the reactor, and flows back out. The outgoing water is warmer than it came in, but under French law, it cannot be returned to the river if it would push the river's temperature above environmental limits. The fish and the insects and the whole ecosystem of the river depend on the water staying within a certain range. In 2003, the Loire was already warm from the relentless sun and weeks without rain. Adding reactor heat on top of a river that was already above its normal maximum was against the law, so the plant had to cut output. Belleville was not alone. Across France, 17 reactors reduced power or shut down entirely during the heatwave. The country that depended most on nuclear electricity for its grid was forced to buy power from neighbouring countries at precisely the moment demand for air conditioning and fans was spiking. The irony was extraordinary. The heat caused a power shortage at the exact moment everyone needed more power to fight the heat. Factories that relied on steady electricity had to slow down. Hospitals running on backup systems scrambled. The cascade of consequences from a single high-pressure system sitting over the continent kept widening in directions that had never been anticipated. And if the climate projection scientists were building were accurate, the question of how to keep France's power grid running through future heatwaves would soon become one of the most urgent engineering problems in Europe. Every summer in Europe since 2003 has been lived in the shadow of that summer. Scientists who study heat use it as a baseline. Emergency planners use it as a stress test. And the public, at least in France and Spain and Italy, has a memory that sharpens at the first forecast of a major heat wave. But knowledge is only useful if it gets applied in time. The summer of 2019 arrived as a test. A heat wave built across Western Europe in late June and pushed temperatures in France past 114 degrees in some locations. The previous national record had stood for nearly a century. This one shattered it by several degrees in a single afternoon. Germany hit its all-time record. The Netherlands hit its all-time record. Britain crept toward its all-time record. Paris recorded a temperature higher than it had ever measured in the city's history. For anyone watching in 2003, the conditions would have been terrifying. And yet the outcome was strikingly different. France's alert system activated, cooling centres opened, the registry of vulnerable residents triggered a wave of check-in calls. Hospitals had been pre-stocked with supplies. Nursing homes, all now required by law to have air conditioning, kept their residents inside in controlled environments. Local governments had heat action plans. The national television networks ran public service announcements. Every piece of infrastructure that had been built in the 15 years since the disaster came online at once. Compared to 2003, the 2019 wave in France killed far fewer people. The temperatures were comparable in some regions. The number of people at risk had, if anything, grown, because France's population was older than it had been in 2003, but the death toll was a fraction of what it had been. The systems worked. Preparations saved lives that the same heat 16 years earlier had taken. Italy never had its reckoning the way France did. France had the refrigerated trucks and the unclaimed bodies, and the national scandal that forced a political response. Italy had a death toll that researchers now estimate exceeded 20,000 people in the summer of 2003, making it the hardest hit country in Europe. But the count came out slowly, in academic papers published over years, without the sharp political flashpoint that had forced France to change. As a result, Italy's response was slower, more fragmented, built region by region rather than from the top down. Some cities developed excellent heat action plans, others lagged for years. The national registry France had built within months of its disaster took Italy much longer to develop, and the cost, in subsequent heat waves, showed up in the numbers. Spain faced a similar story. Researchers now believe Spain lost more than 12,000 people in the summer of 2003. The count emerged gradually, without the political crisis that had jolted France. And the reforms came more slowly. This pattern matters enormously for what happens next. Heat waves do not respect national borders. The same blocked atmosphere that baked France will bake Germany. The same night temperatures that killed elderly Parisians will do the same in Budapest or Warsaw. But the readiness each country has built depends heavily on whether they had a disaster stark enough to force the political will to prepare. 2003 was that catalyst for France. The question for the rest of Europe and the world is whether they learn the lesson before, or only after, they experience their own version of it. The London Underground is one of the oldest subway systems in the world. Parts of it were built in the 19th century, deep tunnels dug long before anyone thought much about temperature management. In a normal English summer, those tunnels are merely stuffy. In 2003, they became unbearable. Surface temperatures in London reached 100 degrees Fahrenheit during the peak of the wave. That broke a record that had stood since British weather records began. Asphalt on roads softened. Steel train tracks buckled in the heat, forcing speed restrictions across the national rail network. The London Eye, the giant observation wheel on the south bank of the Thames, closed for a day because the glass pods became too hot for visitors. Britain had never planned for heat the way it had planned for cold. The country that built elaborate systems for managing ice and snow and flooding had no equivalent system for extreme warmth. Most British homes had no air conditioning. The cultural assumption was that England did not get that hot, not seriously hot, not dangerously hot. 2003 broke that assumption hard. 2,000 people died in the United Kingdom that summer from heat-related causes. For a country that did not count heat as a serious hazard, 2,000 deaths landed as a genuine shock. Parliament began asking questions about whether the national health system was prepared for future events. The housing standards that had never required insulation from summer heat, rather than winter cold, came under scrutiny. And a slow conversation began about what an English summer would look like by mid-century. Scotland, far to the north, had its own unexpected crisis. Salmon are extraordinarily sensitive to water temperature. As rivers warmed through July and August, the conditions for spawning deteriorated rapidly. Populations already under pressure from other threats found themselves gasping in rivers that had become too warm to sustain them. The heat wave that killed people in apartments also reached into rivers and forests, touching things that seemed impossibly far from a blocked pressure system sitting over France. Portugal was on fire. While France was counting its dead and Germany was watching its rivers drop, Portugal was burning. The heat that cooked Central Europe had moved west along with severe drought, and the forests of Portugal, already dry from months without rain, ignited across the country. By the time the fires were controlled, more than 500,000 acres had burned. That is an area roughly the size of Rhode Island, turned to charcoal in a single summer. The fires killed people directly. They also killed the soil. When trees burn, the root systems that hold soil in place are gone. The following winter, when the rains finally returned, they washed millions of tons of that exposed topsoil into Portugal's rivers. The rivers turned dark and silted. River ecosystems that had not burned were still damaged by what washed into them afterward. The consequence of a single summer's heat reached forward into years of ecological cost. In neighbouring Spain, the story was similar. Temperatures in parts of Spain hit 117 degrees. Agricultural losses across the Iberian Peninsula ran into billions of euros as crops wilted in fields that could not be irrigated fast enough. Dairy cattle in France, Spain and Italy produced less milk under the heat stress. Poultry farms reported mass die-offs. The food system, which most people think of as separate from the weather, was exposed as deeply connected to the temperature of the air. European farmers lost the equivalent of about $15 billion in agricultural production that single summer. Food prices rose. The cost was distributed invisibly across millions of grocery bills in the months that followed. People who had never heard of the 2003 heatwave still paid a price for it. There is a phrase scientists now use when they talk about what 2003 revealed. They call it a compound event, a cascade where one thing goes wrong and then that failure breaks something else, and that breakage breaks something else, and suddenly a hot summer becomes a continent-wide catastrophe. The heat dried the soil. Dry soil could not cool the air. The air got hotter. Hot air expanded the heat dome above. The heat dome shut off the winds. Without wind, no rain. Without rain, rivers dropped. Low rivers meant nuclear plants had to cut power. Less power meant less cooling. Less cooling meant more deaths. Dead crops meant food shortages. Food shortages raised prices. Rising prices hit the poorest families hardest, the same families least likely to have air conditioning. Every link in that chain was real. Every one of them happened in the summer of 2003. What climate scientists found when they modelled the future was that compound events are not anomalies. They are the signature of a warming climate. In a cooler world, these chains of failure rarely line up perfectly. In a warmer world, they line up more often, because the baseline conditions, the soil moisture, the river temperatures, the frequency of blocking patterns, all shift in the same direction at once. The research published after 2003 planted a seed that has been growing in climate science ever since. It is not enough to prepare for one disaster at a time. A serious heat emergency can trigger energy crises, food crises, ecological crises, and social crises in the same summer simultaneously. The institutions that respond to each of those separately, hospitals for the sick, power utilities for the grid, farmers for the food, emergency services for the fires, all found themselves stretched beyond capacity in 2003 because none of them had trained for a scenario in which everything broke at once. Building that kind of connected resilience is the hardest thing a society can do, and the story of how Europe has tried to do it, and how far it still has to go, reaches into every corner of the challenge ahead. 8 years before France buried its dead in refrigerated food trucks, Chicago was doing something similar. It was July of 1995. A wall of heat settled over the city for 5 days. The thermometer on the 14th of that month hit 106 degrees, and the humidity pushed the felt temperature past 120. 739 people died. The Cook County Medical Examiner's Office ran out of space. A refrigerated truck sat parked outside to hold the overflow. A sociologist named Eric Klinenberg spent years afterward mapping those deaths. He was trying to understand why certain neighborhoods in Chicago had been devastated, while others, equally hot, had survived far better. The physical conditions were similar. The temperature differences between blocks were marginal, but the death rates were dramatically different. What he found changed how researchers thought about heat forever. The neighborhoods with the highest death rates shared one characteristic more than any other. They had been gutted, businesses had closed, buildings sat empty, nobody walked the streets. The social web that keeps people alive, neighbors knowing neighbors, shop owners recognizing regulars, informal eyes watching out for the elderly, had frayed to nothing. 2 blocks away from a neighborhood where dozens died, Klinenberg found a community that had lost almost no one. The same heat, different social infrastructure. People there knew each other. Somebody had noticed when a neighbor stopped coming out. Somebody had knocked on a door. The lesson arrived in Europe as a published book in 2003. The same summer, France was counting its dead. The connection was devastating in its clarity. The disaster was not random. The victims were not just unlucky. They were the people the city had made invisible, and the heat only exposed what had been true all along. Here is the strange problem with measuring how many people a heatwave kills. You almost certainly get it wrong at first. When a hurricane destroys a city, the bodies are visible. The damage is immediate. The count, however tragic, is concrete. Heat is invisible. It leaves no wreckage. It does not break windows or lift roofs. It kills people who are already fragile by pushing their overworked hearts and failing kidneys past their last reserves. And when those people die, their death certificates say heart failure, kidney failure, respiratory failure. The summer heat that finished them gets no mention. This is why scientists use a method called excess mortality to measure heat disasters. They compare the number of deaths that happened during a heat wave with the number that would have been expected based on normal historical patterns for that time of year. The gap between those two numbers is the shadow of the heat. It captures all the deaths that would not have happened if the temperatures had stayed normal. France used excess mortality to arrive at its final count of nearly 15,000 deaths in the summer of 2003. The initial official estimate was much lower. Spain and Italy took years to arrive at their true figures because the political will to do the counting had to overcome the discomfort of the answer. The excess mortality method has a second, quieter implication. If heat deaths are invisible, then the ones we count in ordinary years are also likely undercounted. Every summer, somewhere, a heat wave kills people, and the record says something else. The real toll of heat as a public health threat, across decades, is almost certainly larger than the numbers that reach the headlines. 2003 was the summer the number got too large to hide. It forced the measurement, and the measurement forced the world to look at what it had been missing. Heat does not choose its victims at random. It follows the lines of inequality that were already drawn into the city before a single thermometer climbed. In cities across the world, the poorest neighborhoods are consistently the hottest, not by a small margin. In some American cities, a neighborhood on the wealthy side of town can be 15 degrees cooler than a neighborhood less than 2 miles away. The difference is trees, shade, greenery, parks. Rich neighborhoods have them. poor ones often do not because of decades of decisions about where to invest and where to let go. When a heatwave arrives, the wealthy neighbourhood has natural cooling. The poor one has concrete that has been baking since sunrise, radiating heat all night, giving the people living there no chance to recover. The same weather kills in one place. Elsewhere, people sit under trees with a glass of water and call it a hot afternoon. This pattern showed up in Paris in 2003. The mortality maps lined up almost perfectly with the density maps. The people who died were concentrated in the oldest, most built-up, least green parts of the city. The people who survived were more often in neighbourhoods with parks, with cross-ventilation, with some measure of breathing room. It showed up in Chicago in 1995, where the blocks with the highest death rates were often those that had been systematically deprived of investment for decades. It shows up today in cities across the American South and Southwest, where black residents die from heat at roughly double the rate of white residents in the same cities. Heat is described as a natural disaster. The deaths it causes follow patterns drawn by human choices about housing, trees, investment, and neighbourhood. The disaster is natural. The vulnerability is built. By the summer of 2022, Europe believed it had learned the lessons of 2003. France had its 4-level alert system. Nursing homes had air conditioning. The registry of vulnerable residents was running. The cooling islands were open in Paris. Countries across the continent had built, in varying degrees of completeness, some version of what France had pioneered, and then 61,000 people died. The summer of 2022 was the hottest ever recorded in Europe. Heat waves rolled across the continent in waves. Temperatures in Britain hit 104 degrees Fahrenheit, the highest ever recorded there. Spain's southern cities exceeded 114. Portugal recorded one of its deadliest sequences of heat days on record. And all across Europe, the systems that had been built, the alert plans, the cooling centres, the phone registries were activated and were simply outmatched by the scale of what arrived. The systems helped. Researchers estimated that the plans put in place since 2003 had saved thousands of lives. But the temperatures had grown faster than the defences. The same preparation that would have been adequate for a heatwave 10 degrees cooler was insufficient for this one. Scientists looking at the numbers pointed out that in 2022, Europe faced something qualitatively different from what it had prepared for. The world had warmed enough that the baseline summer had shifted. The cool end of a heatwave was now warmer than the hot end used to be. The question the deaths in 2022 raised was one that Europe did not have a comfortable answer to. How do you prepare for a level of heat that has never happened before? And how do you do it every summer, as the baseline keeps moving? The human body has an absolute limit. In a world with enough heat and enough humidity, sweating stops working. The air around you is already saturated with moisture. Your sweat has nowhere to go. It sits on your skin. Your core temperature rises. The cooling system fails not from overuse but from physics. The air simply cannot hold any more water. Scientists describe this limit in terms of something called wet bulb temperature, a measurement that combines heat and humidity the way your body actually experiences them. At a wet bulb temperature of around 95 degrees Fahrenheit, even a young, healthy person sitting still in the shade with unlimited water cannot survive more than a few hours. The cooling math no longer works. Death is simply a matter of time. Parts of the Persian Gulf and South Asia have already briefly touched or approached that threshold on isolated days. Jacobabad, a city in Pakistan, crossed it twice in a single year. The people there survived because they found shade, they rested, they limited their movement, they drew on every trick available, but the margin was gone. There was no buffer left. Climate projections suggest that by the end of this century, under the higher warming scenarios, large regions of South Asia and the Middle East could regularly experience conditions near or beyond human survivability. These are regions home to hundreds of millions of people, many of them outdoor workers, farmers and labourers who have no choice but to be outside. Unlike Europe in 2003, where the victims were mostly elderly people in apartments, the population at risk in these regions includes working-age adults, whose labour keeps them exposed during the worst hours of the day. The 2003 heatwave was a catastrophe in one of the world's most developed and medically advanced regions. What it revealed about human vulnerability to heat applied equally and more severely to places far less equipped to respond. and those places were watching the thermometers climb faster than anywhere else. There is a number scientists use that gets very little attention outside laboratories, but it may be one of the most important figures in the future of human health. That number is 95 degrees Fahrenheit, not as air temperature, as something called wet bulb temperature. The wet bulb temperature measures what happens when you combine heat and humidity. When the air is hot but dry, your sweat evaporates quickly and pulls heat away from your skin. You can survive very high temperatures in dry air as long as you have water to sweat. But when the air is also heavy with moisture, sweat cannot evaporate as easily. Your body's cooling system loses its power. Think of a fan that works brilliantly in a dry room but barely moves air in a bathroom full of steam. Scientists have long estimated that a wet bulb temperature of 95 degrees is roughly the upper limit of human survival. Beyond that point, even a young, healthy person sitting completely still in the shade with unlimited water cannot cool their own body fast enough. Heat stroke becomes inevitable within hours, and here is where the story of 2003 connects to a warning about places far from France. Coastal regions of the Persian Gulf have already recorded conditions close to that threshold. Parts of South Asia touched dangerous wet bulb readings during the worst pre-monsoon weeks. Climate models project that conditions exceeding survivable wet bulb temperatures will occur regularly in parts of South Asia and the Middle East by the middle of this century. Not once in a generation events, regularly, during ordinary summers, for billions of people who cannot relocate, who have no air conditioning, and who must work outside to eat. 2003 killed 70,000 people in wealthy European nations with excellent healthcare systems. What happens when those conditions arrive somewhere with less? In the summer of 2021, a wall of heat descended on one of the most temperate places on Earth, the Pacific Northwest of North America, where summers are famous for mild grey skies and cool ocean breezes, where the normal June high in Seattle is around 70 degrees, where most homes have no air conditioning because there has never been a reason to own one. The heat dome arrived on the last weekend of June. Portland, Oregon, reached 116 degrees. Seattle hit 108. In the small town of Lytton, British Columbia, the thermometer climbed to 121 degrees on June 29th, shattering Canada's all-time heat record by 8 degrees. The following day, a wildfire reduced most of Lytton to ash within minutes. About 800 people died in the Pacific Northwest and Western Canada that week. The deaths looked exactly like what happened in France in 2003. Elderly people alone in apartments, people without air conditioning, people who did not understand because they had never needed to understand that 3 days of heat above 100 degrees in a normally cool city was something their bodies could not survive without help. Climate researchers studying the event calculated that it was at least 150 times more likely to occur in the world we live in than in a pre-industrial climate. Without the warming humans had already put into the atmosphere, an event of this severity would have been essentially impossible. The Pacific Northwest heat dome was not a replay of 2003. It was the same phenomenon in a new place, with a new population of people who had no idea it was coming. Heat is the deadliest weather event in the United States. Every year, it kills more Americans than hurricanes, tornadoes, and floods combined. And yet most people do not know this, because heat deaths do not make dramatic television. A hurricane is visible, its path can be tracked, its arrival is an event. Heat is invisible, it creeps into apartments, it sits on elderly shoulders, it accelerates a heart condition that was already present, and when the death certificate is filed, it often says cardiac arrest, or kidney failure, or respiratory event, with no mention of the temperature outside. This undercounting is not a small error. Researchers who study excess deaths during heat waves by comparing how many people died in a given period versus how many normally die have consistently found that the official count captures only a fraction of the real toll. During some events, the true death toll may be 5 to 10 times higher than what gets officially recorded. This invisibility is part of what makes heat so dangerous. A tornado gets studied, mapped, and planned for. Communities hold drills, emergency systems are built and tested. Heat gets a few paragraphs in the local news and a reminder to drink water. The disconnect between the actual risk and the public sense of the risk has cost lives in every hot summer for decades. The financial cost is also invisible and enormous. Heat lowers productivity. Studies show that students in rooms without air conditioning during heat waves score measurably worse on cognitive tests with slower reaction times. Workers in hot conditions make more mistakes, lift fewer loads, and stop more often. The economic losses from reduced productivity in hot countries are already significant, and they will grow as temperatures rise. The city of Ahmedabad in western India sits in one of the hottest parts of one of the hottest countries on Earth. In the summer of 2010, a heat wave pushed temperatures past 116 degrees for several days and killed more than 1,000 people in the city in a single month. It was the kind of disaster that 2003 had been for France, a sudden, undeniable catastrophe that demanded a response. Ahmedabad responded. The city built the first formal heat action plan in South Asia. It was a simple, practical system, modelled in part on what France and other European cities had built after 2003, a colour-coded alert tied directly to weather forecasts, orange and red warnings posted on electronic signs across the city, text message alerts to vulnerable residents, training programs for healthcare workers, coordination between the weather service and the health department, hospitals, and the local media. Cooling centres opened when the alert fired. Within 5 years of the plan's launch, researchers found it had saved more than 1,000 lives annually in Ahmedabad alone. Just knowing the heat was coming, just having someone check on vulnerable residents, just having the hospital pre-positioned with extra staff and supplies, made a measurable difference. The lesson from Ahmedabad spread. Within a decade, more than 40 cities and states across India had developed their own versions of the plan. The template worked. The tools were cheap and simple. What they required was not technology, but intention. Someone had to decide that heat deaths mattered, that they were preventable, and that preventing them was worth the effort. Air conditioning saves lives. That is a fact supported by decades of research. But air conditioning also makes the underlying problem worse. That tension sits at the centre of one of the hardest challenges in the world today, and it has no simple answer. Every air conditioning unit does two things simultaneously. It cools the space inside, and it dumps heat outside. In a city where millions of units are running at once during a heat wave, that outdoor heat accumulates. Studies in dense cities have found that widespread air conditioning used during peak heat can push street temperatures up by several degrees, making the outdoor environment worse for everyone who is outside and for anyone without cooling of their own. The electricity to run those units has to come from somewhere. For most of the world, it still comes significantly from burning gas or coal. Every unit running on fossil fuel power releases emissions that, over time, add to the warming that makes the heat waves worse in the first place. The air conditioning boom is, in one sense, a loop that feeds itself. And then there is the question of who has access. In the United States, researchers found that air conditioning is systematically less available in the urban core than in the suburbs, and less available in lower income and minority neighbourhoods than in wealthier ones. The people least likely to have home cooling are the same people most likely to live in the hottest parts of the city, the densest, most paved, most heat-retaining neighbourhoods with the fewest trees. The distribution of risk and the distribution of protection run in opposite directions. The path forward is not to ban air conditioning, it is to power it with clean energy, build cities that need less of it through shade and green space and water, and ensure that the protection it provides does not belong only to those who can afford it. In the summer of 2024, Paris hosted the Olympic Games. Athletes from around the world swam in the River Seine for the first time in over a century. The river, which had been too polluted for swimming since the 1920s, had been cleaned through a €1 billion infrastructure project launched years earlier. The opening ceremony floated boats down the Seine past landmarks that the whole world watched. It was a deliberate statement about what a city could become when it decided to change. The decision to clean the Seine had been made long before the Olympics arrived, but the Games gave it a deadline, a funding mechanism, and a global audience. And the connection between the river and the heat of 2003 was direct. One of Paris's core strategies for cooling the city without universal air conditioning was to make the river accessible to the public. Swimmers cool faster in water than in any other medium. A river running through the centre of a city is free, accessible to everyone, and requires no electricity. Parisians who came back from vacation in August 2003 found bodies in their buildings. Parisians who came to the river in the summers that followed found it still closed, still too dirty to touch. 2024 closed that gap. The Olympic rings left, and the swimming zones stayed. There is a quiet argument embedded in this story. Cities do not have to wait for catastrophe to rebuild themselves toward survival. The tools exist. The knowledge exists. What 2003 demonstrated, and what Paris spent 2 decades demonstrating in response, is that the political will to act is the variable. Catastrophe can create it. So can leadership and imagination, even before the catastrophe arrives. Outside the windows of the world's most climate-vulnerable cities, something is changing that most people never notice until it stops. The night air. Nights are warming faster than days. Across Europe, across South Asia, across the American South, the overnight temperature, the temperature that allows your body to recover from a hot day, has climbed faster over the past 50 years than the daytime high. Scientists who study this pattern have found that the warming trend is accelerating, and that sweltering nights where the temperature never drops below 70 degrees, have become roughly 100 times more common in Europe today than they were just 20 years ago. This matters in ways that go beyond comfort. Your body's ability to survive a heat wave depends heavily on what happens at night. Sleep restores organ function. It allows your cardiovascular system to slow, your core temperature to drop, your cells to repair. When nights stay hot, that window closes. Your body enters the next hot day already depleted. Day 2 of a heat wave is more dangerous than day 1. Day 5 is exponentially more dangerous than day 2. The 2003 event ran for 2 weeks of hot nights in a row. That accumulation was a large part of what made it so lethal. The paradox of warming nights creates a specific problem for the places that have historically been coolest. In Finland, in Scotland, in Canada, in the northern United States, the cultural and architectural assumption has always been that summer nights were reliably cool. Houses were built to capture that cold air. Windows opened at dusk and closed at dawn. The cool night was the whole strategy. As nights warm, that strategy stops working, and populations that have lived without air conditioning for centuries find themselves suddenly vulnerable in ways their grandparents never were. 17 years after the summer that exposed everything, France decided to do something Paris had never done in its modern history. The city opened the Seine to public swimming. The river had been closed for bathing since the 1920s. Pollution had made it too dangerous. Industrial runoff, sewage overflows, a century of urban growth that treated the river as a drainage channel rather than a public resource. By 2003, the Seine was clean enough to look at but not clean enough to touch. The cleanup that followed was not motivated purely by the heat crisis, but the connection was clear to everyone who planned it. One of the most effective ways to cool a person fast is immersion in moving water. A river in the centre of a city is a natural cooling centre that costs nothing to build and can hold thousands of people at once. When Paris's outdoor temperature climbed past 100 degrees in the worst weeks, the Seine offered something that no network of emergency phone calls could: immediate physical relief. It took more than 20 years and more than €1 billion to make the river swimmable again. Underground reservoirs to capture stormwater, new wastewater treatment plants, sensors measuring bacteria levels in real time. By 2025, public swimming zones opened along the Seine. Thousands of Parisians swam past Notre Dame on summer afternoons, the same river their grandparents had dismissed as irredeemable. This is the kind of transformation that the summer of 2003 made necessary. The city that buried the unclaimed dead in the poor section of a cemetery in Thiès had, over 2 decades, made the river swim again. The work of disaster recovery, done slowly and seriously, changes cities in ways the disaster itself could never have predicted. The hardest thing about heat as a hazard is that it asks something different from every other kind of emergency. A flood is external. It comes for you, and you run. A fire is visible, and it arrives with a sound. Heat is internal. It happens inside your own body, quietly, in a room you chose to be in, surrounded by walls you thought were protecting you. The warning signs are easy to miss, especially for the people most at risk. An 80-year-old woman who has been living alone in a top-floor apartment in Lyon for 40 years knows that apartment better than any emergency planner ever will. She knows when the radiator knocks, when the staircase creaks, when the neighbour across the hall comes home at 6. What she may not know is that her body's ability to sense heat and trigger sweating has slowed with age, that her heart is working harder than it used to just to push blood to her skin, that the apartment that felt fine at 90 degrees last summer is killing her this summer, because this summer the nights have stayed 10 degrees warmer. The researchers who study heat mortality use a phrase to describe this: the silent disaster. It produces no visible damage. The infrastructure stands. The streets are intact. The city looks normal, while something catastrophic is happening behind closed doors. Emergency services designed to respond to visible crises, burning buildings, flooding streets, overturned vehicles, have no easy way to see a heat emergency in progress until the hospitals start filling. The monitoring systems built after 2003 try to address this. Temperature sensors, mortality surveillance systems that watch for unusual spikes in death registrations, alert networks that phone registered at-risk residents. But the truth is that the most effective early warning system for heat is still a neighbour, a person who knows your name and notices when you have not come down for your morning walk. Somewhere in the gap between what science knows and what governments have built, people are still dying unnecessarily from heat. This gap exists in every country at every level of development, and understanding it is one of the most important public health challenges of the coming decades. Countries with excellent heat action plans still see deaths during major heat waves because the plans were built around the temperatures of the 20th century and the events of the 21st century exceed them. France's alert system was designed after 2003. It has saved many lives, but it was calibrated to a range of temperatures that the past decade has repeatedly exceeded. The thresholds that trigger the highest level alerts may need to move as the baseline moves, and the infrastructure that responds to those alerts, the hospitals, the cooling centres, the welfare workers, may need to scale up substantially to match the intensity of future events. Countries with no heat plans at all are in a far more dangerous position. Large parts of sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia and South America have growing urban populations, rapidly rising temperatures, and almost no formal infrastructure for heat response. The people in these places have less air conditioning, live in denser and hotter neighbourhoods, work outdoors for their income, and have limited access to healthcare. When a major heatwave strikes, they have almost nothing to catch them. The world built its emergency response infrastructure for the disasters of the past. The disasters of the future are already arriving. The summer of 2003 ended. The high-pressure system finally moved in late August. Cool Atlantic air swept back across France. The temperatures dropped. The hospitals cleared. The emergency food trucks were cleaned and returned to their owners. The unclaimed bodies in the improvised mortuary were eventually buried, most of them quietly, with city officials and a few strangers standing in the rain. France spent the following autumn processing what had happened. Parliamentary hearings, health ministry reports, academic studies running into the hundreds. The question that kept returning was not just about the heat. It was about the society that had let 70,000 people die in a warm summer without anyone noticing in time. A society where people could die alone and be undiscovered for weeks. Where the August vacation was sacrosanct enough that even a national emergency could not immediately interrupt it. Where the political reflex when the bodies were counted was to assign blame rather than build systems. The lesson that researchers kept arriving at was not comfortable. Heat waves do not create social failure, they reveal it. The isolation, the neglect of the elderly, the gaps in welfare systems, the inequality in housing and green space and air conditioning, all of that existed before the summer of 2003. The heat simply made it impossible to look away. Every heatwave since has done the same. The Pacific Northwest Dome in 2021, the European waves of 2022 and 2023, each one exposing in its specific geography and demographics the shape of the inequalities that precede it. And the question that each one leaves behind is not whether the next one is coming. It is whether the society it arrives in will have built something different by the time it does. There is a graveyard in the southern suburbs of Paris, in a town called Thiais, where nearly 100 people who died in the summer of 2003 are buried together. They died alone. Nobody came to claim them. They were interred at public expense in the poorest section of the cemetery, with no ceremony, no family, and almost no one present. They are the most literal symbol of what the heatwave revealed, that a city can allow people to become so invisible that their deaths barely register. A few years after the burials, the graves received small markers. Some volunteers began visiting them. A researcher named Richard Keller spent years reconstructing the life stories of these forgotten dead. A man who had immigrated from another country and kept all his papers in a single folder. A woman who had lived in the same apartment for 30 years and knew no one in her building. People whose lives had contracted so completely that when heat arrived in the night, there was no one to call and no one to call them. Keller's book about these deaths was not primarily about climate or policy. It was about what happens to a human being when a city grows around them without growing toward them. The structures meant to catch people, the welfare state, the neighborhood solidarity, the family ties, all of them had gaps that were invisible in normal times and catastrophic in a crisis. The lesson is not that cities need better alert systems, though they do. It is that alert systems are the last line of defense. They catch people at the moment of danger. What happens before the danger, the daily texture of a city, who knows their neighbours, who shops at the local market, who has someone checking on them, determines whether the emergency system ever gets the chance to help. The graves at Thiais are not a memorial to a weather event. They are a portrait of modern loneliness. The science of extreme heat has changed dramatically since 2003. Scientists can now calculate within weeks of a major heat wave how much more likely human greenhouse gas emissions made it. They can identify which neighbourhoods will be hottest, which residents are most at risk, which hours of a heat wave are most deadly, which interventions save the most lives per dollar spent. The tools for understanding heat have become precise and powerful. The gap between what science knows and what the world has built has not closed at the same pace. Fewer than a third of the countries most vulnerable to extreme heat have formal national heat action plans. Cities in the fastest warming parts of the world are building dense urban environments without heat resilience embedded in the design. Buildings are still being constructed without considering their thermal performance in a hotter future. Infrastructure is being laid down that assumes a climate that no longer exists. The climate attribution studies born from the research that followed 2003 have given the world a new tool. For the first time in history, when a major heat event strikes, scientists can step forward within days and say with confidence, "Here is how much more likely human activity made this." That specificity changes the conversation. It makes heat not a matter of fate or randomness, but of choices made over decades about what fuels to burn and what kind of world to build. Every heat wave now carries that annotation. Every summer that breaks records comes with the understanding that the record was not inevitable. And every city that builds a green space, trains a welfare worker, opens a cooling centre, or restores a river, is writing a different annotation into the same story. The summer of 2003 sits in the scientific literature as a boundary moment. Before it, heat was treated as a seasonal nuisance, something to manage with practical advice and a few days of warning. After it, heat became one of the most studied and consequential threats in public health. The field of climate attribution was born from the question it raised. Thousands of papers have followed the deaths. National heat plans were written. Cities changed. Scientists who project the future use the summer of 2003 as a reference point, precisely because it represents what an extreme event looked like at a specific level of global warming. When they run models of what an equivalent summer would look like with one more degree of warming, the numbers are not simply worse. They're different in kind. What killed 70,000 people at one warming level does not just kill 70,001 at higher level. The relationship between temperature and death is not linear. Each degree of additional warming amplifies the risk faster than the last. This is why the stakes of the choices being made right now about emissions and energy in city design extend far beyond weather forecasts. They extend to the question of how many summers in the next half-century look like 2003, how many look worse, and how many places on Earth experience an event that makes 2003 look mild. The science is clear. The future is not fixed. The gap between the worst possible outcome and the best possible outcome is still wide enough that what happens in the next decade matters enormously. 2003 was not the ending of anything. It was a beginning. The summer of 2003 began with heat and ended with graves. It ended with a government humiliated, a healthcare system shaken, and a continent of scientists asking questions they had never thought to ask before. And it ended with something less visible but more lasting, a decision, made in hundreds of offices and laboratories and city halls across Europe, that this could not be allowed to happen again. That decision produced real things: alert systems, cooling centres, a registry of vulnerable people who receive phone calls when the temperature climbs, trees planted along Parisian streets by the tens of thousands, a river made swimmable again, a hospital system redesigned around the possibility of a mass casualty event caused by sunshine. None of it was sufficient by itself. Each summer since has exposed new gaps. The scale of future warming means that the work is not finished and may never be finished, only maintained and expanded and made more ambitious as the need grows. What 2003 gave to the world was clarity. Before it, heat was easy to dismiss, a background condition, an inconvenience that the healthy and the young and the comfortable managed without much thought. After it, heat was undeniably a killer, one that moved silently, one that targeted the alone and the old and the poor with specific precision, one that could collapse power grids and empty rivers and bring mountains down, one that was already connected through decades of accumulated emissions to the choices the world had made about how to power itself. The 70,000 people who died in that summer did not die because the weather was unusual. They died because the world was unprepared for what the weather was becoming. That preparation, the work of closing the gap between what is coming and what we have built, is the defining task of the decades ahead. The summer of 2003 left a warning. The question it asked, across every country and every city and every vulnerable person living alone above a hot street, is still being answered.